In the scorching Nevada desert, where heat rippled across cracked asphalt, a furious superstar was about to pick the wrong man to yell at. What began as a routine landing gone wrong turned volatile when an aging cargo pilot was accused of nearly killing a Hollywood icon midair. Captain Elias Crow wasn't your typical retired flyer in a patched-up plane. For 4 decades, he'd been a special operations transport pilot, known for executing split-second maneuvers that turned disasters into miracles. When Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson marched across the tarmac, shouting accusations in front of cameras, he had no idea he was confronting a man who just saved his life and the lives of 24 others with a move that defied physics. Crow stood his ground, calm under fire until a shadow stepped out from the cargo plane's doorway. Chuck Norris descended the stairs, eyes steady beneath the desert glare, and said quietly, "Before you finish yelling, maybe thank the man who kept you breathing." What began as a celebrity outburst would become a reckoning between ego and experience. The Desert Wind's airstrip would never forget the day one man's fury met another man's mastery, and learn the hard way what real heroes look like. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The desert heat shimmered like liquid glass across the tarmac as Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson's private jet touched down with a sharp screech of rubber against asphalt. The sleek aircraft rolled to a stop beside a weathered cargo plane that looked like it had been flying since the Korean War. All rivets and patches, its once silver skin now dulled to the color of old pewter. Before the engines had fully wound down, Dwayne was already unbuckling his harness, jaw clenched tight enough to crack teeth. Captain Monroe, his pilot, turned in the cockpit seat, one hand still on the controls. "Sir, maybe we should," number Dwayne's voice cut through the cabin like a blade. What happened up there was inexcusable. Someone could have died. The cabin door burst open, and Dwayne charged down the stairs, his designer sunglasses reflecting the blazing sun. Each step hammered against the metal with the force of a man who'd spent his life commanding attention. And right now, every ounce of that presence was focused on the scuffed cargo plane 30 yards away. Ground crew members paused mid-task, wrenches hanging loose in oil-stained hands. A few mechanics rolled out from under aircraft, sensing the electric tension that always preceded trouble. The desert air, thick with a smell of jet fuel and hot metal, seemed to hold its breath. Dwayne spotted his target immediately. A small elderly man descending the cargo plane, steps with careful, measured movements. Captain Elias Crow moved like someone who understood that every motion mattered. Shoulders straight, head up, but without the swagger of youth. His flight suit hung loose on a frame that had probably been solid once decades ago. "Hey!" Dwayne's voice boomed across the air, causing a flock of desert sparrows to explode from their perch on a nearby fuel truck. "You, pilot." Crow turned slowly, his weathered face showing no surprise, no fear, just the patient attention of someone who'd heard worse things shouted in worse places. He waited. Dwayne closed the distance in long, aggressive strides, his shadow falling across the old man like a threat. "You want to explain what the hell you were thinking up there? That stunt you pulled nearly killed everyone on my plane." The words hung in the superheated air. Around them, the airstrip began to gather its usual cast of observers. Jordan Reyes, the young mechanic who'd been refueling a Cessna, dropped his hose and hurried over. His dark eyes darted between Dwayne and Crow, torn between awe at seeing a celebrity and protective concern for the old pilot who'd been teaching him to read weather patterns. "Sir?" Jordan started, his voice cracking slightly. "Captain Crow is one of the most—" "I wasn't talking to you, kid." Dwayne's gaze never left Crow. I'm talking to the cowboy who thinks the sky is his personal playground. Crow's response was quiet, almost lost beneath the distant hum of aircraft engines. Captain Elias Crow, sir, if there was an issue with my flight path. I'm sure we can review the review. Dwayne's laugh was harsh. We came within seconds of a mid-air collision. My pilot had to throw us into a dive that damn near ripped the wings off. And you want to talk about reviewing paperwork? The sound of boots on gravel announced the arrival of Leon Mara Collins striding across the tarmac with the purposeful gait of someone accustomed to restoring order. Her uniform was crisp despite the heat, and her dark hair was pulled back in a regulation bun that somehow managed to look both professional and slightly severe. "Mr. Johnson," she called out as she approached, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent years directing air traffic in combat zones. "I need you to step back from my pilot." Dwayne turned, his expression shifting to something that might have been charming under different circumstances. "Lieutenant, I appreciate your position, but your pilot here I don't care what you think happened." Mara interrupted, positioning herself slightly between the two men. "This is my airstrip, and I don't allow unauthorized confrontations on my tarmac. If you have a complaint about flight operations, there's a proper channel." Proper channel. Dwayne's voice rose again, and Jordan winced. "Lady, proper channels don't fix near-death experiences. This old man was flying like he learned on a crop duster and forgot he's sharing the sky with jets that cost more than his entire. That's enough." Crow's voice was still quiet, but something in it made Dwayne pause. The old pilot's eyes, pale blue like winter sky, held steady on Dwayne's face. "If you have concerns about my flying, I'm happy to discuss them. But I won't stand here while you disrespect the aircraft or the people who maintain her." The simple dignity in those words should have diffused the situation. Instead, they seemed to stoke Dwayne's anger higher. "Disrespect?" He gestured wildly at the cargo plane. "You call flying that rust bucket into commercial air traffic respectful? You call putting lives at risk respectful?" From the edge of the growing crowd, a woman's voice cut through the tension. "Are you getting this? This is incredible." Tessa Lang held her phone high, live streaming the confrontation with the practiced ease of someone who turned a dozen routine stories into viral content. Her bright red lipstick stood out against the desert backdrop as she provided running commentary. "Folks, I'm here at Desert Winds Airstrip where Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson is confronting an elderly pilot after what appears to have been a near-miss incident. The tension here is absolutely electric." The mention of live streaming seemed to energize Dwayne rather than calm him. His voice carried farther now, projecting to the growing circle of phone cameras and curious faces. "You want to know what happened up there?" He pointed toward the sky. "This pilot's reckless flying forced my crew into an emergency maneuver. We had passengers on board, people depending on us to get them home safely, and this guy treats the sky like it's his personal air show." Crow remained motionless, hands clasped loosely behind his back. His silence wasn't defensive. It was the patience of someone who'd learned that some storms had to run their course before the real conversation could begin. Captain Monroe appeared at Dwayne's shoulder, having finally shut down the jet systems. The Navy veteran's face was tight with the kind of professional discomfort that came from watching a situation spiral out of control. "Boss," he said quietly, "the telemetry data from our encounter doesn't exactly match what you're describing. The other aircraft's maneuver was aggressive, yes, but the precision was, I don't want to hear about precision." Dwayne snapped. "I want to hear about safety, about responsibility, about not endangering lives because you're too stubborn to retire." The last words hit the assembled crowd like a physical blow. Jordan's hands clenched into fists. Several of the older ground crew members shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the particular cruelty of age-based dismissal. Mara's jaw tightened, but Crow just nodded slowly, as if he'd heard variations of the speech before. "You're upset, sir. That's understandable. Fear can make anyone angry." "I'm not afraid of anything," Dwayne shot back. But there was something defensive in his tone now. Something that suggested Crow had touched a nerve. "Of course not," Crow replied gently. "But your passengers were scared. Your crew was scared. And when people we care about are in danger, we look for someone to blame. That's natural." The simple acknowledgement seemed to deflate some of Dwayne's fury, but only for a moment. Then he was back to projecting, playing to the cameras that were now documenting every word. What's natural is expecting professional standards from professional pilots. What's natural is holding people accountable when they endanger lives. Tessa's livestream comments were exploding, hundreds of viewers weighing in with opinions, jokes, and hot takes. Some sided with the celebrity, others with the underdog pilot. The story was already writing itself across social media. The Rock vs. Elderly Pilot Desert Showdown. Jordan couldn't stay quiet any longer. Captain Crow has 40 years of accident-free flying. He blurted out, his voice cracking with emotion. He saved more lives than 40 years of what might have been lucky breaks. Dwayne interrupted. "That doesn't excuse what happened today." "What exactly do you think happened today?" Mara asked, her tone shifting toward interrogation mode. "Because from where I sit, I see a cargo flight that deviated from its planned route and a private jet that encountered wake turbulence. I don't see a near collision. Wake turbulence." Dwayne's eyes flashed. "Lady, we dropped 300 FT in 2 seconds. My pilot had to." "Your pilot executed a standard avoidance maneuver," Monroe interjected, finally finding his voice. "The other aircraft's movement was sudden, but it wasn't random. Someone doesn't pull a turn that tight without a damn good reason." Dwayne rounded on his own pilot. "Whose side are you on here?" "The side of facts," Monroe replied evenly. "And the facts say the cargo pilot knew exactly what he was doing." The statement hung in the desert air like a challenge. For a moment, the only sounds were the distant hum of generators and the soft whisper of wind across aluminum wing surfaces. Then Crow spoke, his voice carrying just far enough to reach the inner circle of observers. "The maneuver was necessary. That's all I can say. Necessary." Dwayne seized on the word. Necessary for what? A shortcut showing off for the cameras. Crow's pale eyes found Dwayne's face. There was something in that gaze. Not anger, not defensiveness, but a kind of weary sadness that suggested he'd carried heavier burdens than one man's accusation. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "the most important flights are the ones nobody sees." The cryptic response only fueled Dwayne's frustration. "Stop talking in riddles. Tell these people what really happened up there." The crowd had grown larger now. Mechanics, ground crew, a few pilots from other aircraft, all drawn by the spectacle of a Hollywood star in full confrontation mode. Phone cameras captured every gesture, every expression, turning a private airstrip into a public arena. Tessa's commentary had shifted from excited to professionally dramatic. "The tension here is incredible, folks. We've got a major celebrity demanding answers from an elderly pilot who seems determined to keep his secrets. The question everyone's asking is, what really happened in the sky over desert winds?" Dwayne seemed to feed off the energy of the crowd, his voice rising to carry his words to every observer. "I came here to film a documentary about aviation heroes. Real heroes, people who understand that flying isn't about ego or taking risks. It's about getting people home safely." He gestured broadly at the airstrip, at the assembled faces, at the cameras recording his every word. But instead of heroes, I find cowboys. Instead of professionals, I find reckless pilots who think they own the sky. The words were calculated for maximum impact, and they landed like physical blows. Jordan's face flushed red. Several of the older ground crew members exchanged angry glances. Mara's hand moved instinctively toward her radio, ready to call for backup if things escalated further. But Crow just stood there, absorbing the verbal assault with the same patient endurance he might have shown during a long, difficult flight through bad weather. His hands remained clasped behind his back, his shoulders straight, his expression calm. "You're entitled to your opinion, sir," he said when Dwayne finally paused for breath. "But I've been flying since before you were born, and I've never put an aircraft in the sky that I couldn't bring home safely." Safely? Dwayne's laugh was bitter. "Tell that to my passengers. Tell that to my crew. Tell that to everyone who's watching this and wondering if their next flight is going to be piloted by someone who thinks rules are suggestions." The confrontation had reached a fever pitch. With Dwayne's voice echoing off the hangar walls and Tessa's livestream numbers climbing toward 4 figures, the desert sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the scene in golden light that made everything look cinematic, which only added to the surreal nature of the moment. Then, just as Dwayne opened his mouth for another verbal salvo, a sound cut through the tension like a knife through silk. The soft click of an aircraft door opening. Every head turned toward the cargo plane where the cabin door was swinging wide to reveal a silhouette against the dim interior. The figure in the doorway was backlit, indistinct, but something about the way it stood, perfectly still, perfectly balanced, sent a ripple of anticipation through the crowd. Tessa's commentary faltered mid-sentence. Jordan's mouth fell open. Even Dwayne's momentum seemed to stumble as he realized that someone else was about to enter his confrontation. The figure stepped forward into the light, and the entire airstrip seemed to hold its breath. Chuck Norris stood in the doorway of the cargo plane, his eyes taking in the scene below with the calm assessment of someone who'd walked into hostile territory more times than most people could count. He didn't rush down the stairs. He didn't shout. He simply stood there, his presence alone shifting the entire energy of the confrontation. The silence stretched for a heartbeat, then another. Somewhere in the crowd, someone whispered his name. Tessa's phone trembled slightly as she tried to frame both men in her shot. And in that moment of perfect suspended tension, everyone on the airstrip understood that the rules of the game had just changed completely. The silence that followed Chuck Norris's appearance was unlike anything the desert airstrip had ever witnessed. It wasn't the absence of sound. Generators still hummed, wind still whispered across aluminum surfaces, but rather the complete suspension of human breath, as if the 40-some people gathered on the tarmac had collectively forgotten how to exhale. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Chuck descended the cargo plane stairs with deliberate precision, each step measured and controlled. He wore simple clothes, khaki pants, a button-down shirt, boots that had seen real work, but moved with the fluid economy of someone who'd never wasted emotion in his life. His beard was neatly trimmed, his eyes clear and alert as they swept across the assembled crowd. Tessa's hand shook slightly as she tried to keep both men in frame. Her live-stream comments had exploded into chaos. Hundreds of viewers typing in all caps, flame emojis, and shocked faces. The viewer count was climbing toward 1,000, then 500, numbers she'd never seen on her local news streams. "Folks," she whispered into her phone, her professional composure cracking slightly. Chuck Norris just stepped off that cargo plane? I repeat, Chuck Norris is here. This just became a completely different story. Dwayne stood frozen mid-gesture, his pointed finger still extended toward Crow, his mouth still open with whatever accusation he'd been about to hurl. The arrival of Chuck had stolen not just his momentum, but his very breath. For perhaps the first time in his adult life, Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson was completely upstaged. Not by theatrics or volume, but by simple, overwhelming presence. Chuck's boots touched the tarmac, and he paused there, taking in the scene with a patient assessment of someone reading tactical terrain. His eyes moved from Dwayne to Crow, to the circle of observers, to the cameras. When his gaze fell on Tessa's phone, she actually lowered it slightly, as if seeking permission to continue recording. "Afternoon?" Chuck said, his voice carrying easily across the tarmac without being raised. The single word somehow contained both greeting and question, a polite acknowledgement that doubled as a request for explanation. Dwayne's throat worked soundlessly for a moment, before words finally emerged. "Chuck, what are you doing here?" "Flying," Chuck replied with a kind of understated directness that made simple answers feel profound. He looked at Crow, and something passed between the two men. Not words, not gestures, but the sort of recognition that existed between people who'd operated in similar spaces. "Captain?" Chuck said with a slight nod. "Mr. Norris," Crow replied, his voice carrying the same quiet respect he might have shown a superior officer. The exchange was brief, almost formal, but it shifted something fundamental in the crowd's perception. Whatever relationship existed between Chuck and the elderly pilot, it was clearly built on mutual respect. A stark contrast to the confrontation that had been raging moments before. Dwayne seemed to sense the shifting dynamics and doubled down, his voice rising again as he gestured broadly at the cargo plane. "Chuck, I don't know what you're mixed up in here, but this pilot, your pilot, just put dozens of lives at risk with a reckless stunt. We barely avoided a mid-air collision." Chuck's expression didn't change, but he turned slightly to face Dwayne more directly. "That what you think happened?" The question was asked without heat, without challenge, but something in Chuck's tone made Dwayne hesitate. "What I know happened. My pilot can confirm it. We had to take emergency action to avoid." "Captain Monroe," Chuck said, addressing Dwayne's pilot directly. "What does your flight data show?" Monroe shifted uncomfortably, caught between loyalty to his employer and professional honesty. The other aircraft executed a sharp deviation from its flight path. 40-degree bank aggressive descent. We had to respond quickly, but it wasn't random. Chuck said it wasn't a question. Monroe's hesitation lasted only a second. "No, sir. The precision was exceptional. Someone doesn't make a turn like that without extensive training and a compelling reason." Dwayne's face flushed red. "Whose side are you on here?" "The side of accurate information," Chuck replied before Monroe could answer. "Same side Captain Crow's been on for 40 years. Later, Mara Collins stepped forward, recognizing both an opportunity and a responsibility. "Mr. Norris, I'm Lightery Collins, Base Operations. If you were aboard that aircraft during the incident, I'd like to get your statement for the record." Chuck nodded toward the operations building. "Happy to provide whatever information I can, though some details might be restricted." The word restricted hit the crowd like a small detonation. Murmurs rippled through the assembled observers. Jordan looked at Crow with new eyes, as if seeing the old pilot for the first time. Even Tessa's commentary faltered as she processed the implications. Restricted? How? Dwayne demanded, his voice carrying an edge of something that might have been desperation. What aren't you telling us? Chuck's gaze settled on Dwayne with the weight of absolute attention. Son, if you want the truth, you're going to have to listen to more than your own voice. The rebuke was delivered without malice, almost gently, but it landed with devastating precision. Several people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the careful way Chuck had deflated Dwayne's bluster without escalating the confrontation. Dwayne's jaw worked as he processed the response. The cameras were still rolling. Tessa's live stream was still climbing toward 2,000 viewers, and now he was facing not just an elderly pilot, but a living legend who seemed utterly unimpressed by celebrity theatrics. Look, Dwayne said, his tone shifting toward something more reasonable, but still carrying an undercurrent of frustration. I don't care who was on that plane or what kind of mission it was. People could have died today because of that maneuver. That's not acceptable regardless of who's involved. People could have died without it. Crow said quietly, speaking for the first time since Chuck's arrival. The old pilot's pale eyes found Dwayne's face. Sometimes, the most dangerous thing you can do is exactly what everyone expects. Chuck nodded slowly, as if Crow's words had confirmed something. Captain Crow made a difficult decision under pressure. The kind of decision that saves lives. Saves lives. Dwayne's voice cracked slightly. He nearly killed everyone on my plane. No, Chuck said with the kind of quiet certainty that ended arguments. He saved them. The statement hung in the desert air like a challenge to everything Dwayne believed about the incident. Around them, the crowd pressed closer, sensing that they were witnessing something more significant than a simple celebrity outburst. Tessa's phone captured every nuance of the exchange. Her live stream comments scrolling too fast to read as viewers tried to process what they were seeing. The local news story had become something bigger. A collision between two different definitions of heroism played out in real time under the unforgiving desert sun. Jordan cleared his throat nervously, then addressed Chuck directly. Sir, Captain Crow teaches us about precision flying, about making split-second decisions when everything depends on getting it right the first time. Chuck's attention shifted to the young mechanic, and Jordan straightened slightly under the intensity of that gaze. How long you've been working with Captain Crow? 3 years, sir. He's been showing me weather patterns, navigation theory. Says maybe someday I could test for a pilot's license. Good man to learn from, Chuck said simply. But the endorsement carried weight that made Jordan stand a little taller. Dwayne watched this exchange with growing frustration, realizing that the narrative was slipping away from him. This is all very touching, he said, his voice rising again. But it doesn't change what happened up there. It doesn't change the fact that your friend here made a dangerous choice that could have had catastrophic consequences. Chuck turned back to Dwayne, his expression patient but unmoved. You want to know what would have been catastrophic? Following normal procedures when normal procedures wouldn't have been enough. Enough for what? Dwayne demanded. The question hung between them, like a bridge that Chuck seemed unwilling to cross. His eyes flicked to Crow, then to Let Collins, finally back to Dwayne. Some conversations need to happen away from cameras, he said. Finally. Dwayne gestured broadly at the assembled crowd at Tessa's phone at the spectacle he'd created. I started this in public. If there's something that clears your friend's name, then let's hear it in public. Not everything that matters happens in public, Chuck replied. Some of the most important things happen where nobody's watching, where nobody's keeping score. The philosophy behind the words was clear. but Dwayne seemed constitutionally incapable of accepting it. His entire career had been built on public performance, on being seen and celebrated. The idea that significant actions might occur outside the spotlight appeared to genuinely confuse him. Lings Collins stepped into the silence. "Mr. Johnson, if you're serious about getting answers, then you need to follow proper channels. That means coming inside, reviewing official records, and having a rational discussion about what actually happened." Chuck nodded toward the operations building. "Flight data doesn't lie. Radio logs don't perform for cameras. If you want truth, that's where you'll find it." Dwayne looked around the circle of faces, some sympathetic, others clearly shifting their allegiance toward the quiet pilot and his unexpected defender. Tessa's live stream had become a real-time referendum on celebrity versus substance, and the comments were increasingly critical of his public outburst. "Fine," he said finally, his voice tight with controlled frustration. "Let's go look at your data. Let's see what really happened up there." Chuck's expression didn't change, but there might have been the faintest hint of approval in his eyes. Truth's the same whether you're looking at it in private or performing for an audience. Question is whether you're ready to hear it. As the group began moving toward the operations building, Dwayne cast one last look back at the cargo plane at the airstrip that had become an unexpected stage for his confrontation with a reality he'd never considered. The sun was lower now, painting everything in golden light that made the scene look like something from one of his movies. But unlike his films, there was no script here. No predetermined outcome where the loudest voice automatically won. There was only truth, waiting patiently in a climate-controlled room full of monitors and data logs, ready to reveal whether Dwayne's anger was justified or whether he just publicly humiliated a genuine hero in front of 2,000 live-stream viewers and a desert full of witnesses. The operations building felt like stepping into a different world. Air-conditioned, sterile, humming with the electronic heartbeat of radar screens and communication equipment. Latamara Collins led the group through corridors lined with aviation charts and safety notices. Past offices where duty controllers monitored radio chatter from aircraft, scattered across 3 states. The main briefing room was windowless, dominated by a large display screen connected to the base's radar system and flight data computers. Metal chairs surrounded a conference table scarred by years of coffee cups and pointed discussions. The transition from desert heat to controlled environment seemed to drain some of the confrontational energy from the group, replacing it with the subdued tension of a formal inquiry. Dwayne entered first, still radiating frustration, but clearly affected by the changed atmosphere. His designer clothes and celebrity presence felt oddly out of place among the utilitarian furniture and technical equipment. Chuck followed, moving with the same measured calm he displayed outside, his eyes taking in the room's layout with professional interest. Captain Crow was the last to enter, removing his flight cap and holding it loosely in weathered hands. In the fluorescent lighting, his age showed more clearly. The deep lines around his eyes, the slight tremor in his fingers that spoke of decades of precise instrument work. But his posture remained straight, shoulders squared with a bearing of someone accustomed to briefings and debriefings. Elder Collins activated the main display, and the screen filled with a digital map of the local airspace overlaid with flight paths, altitude markers, and timing data. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd coordinated hundreds of aircraft movements in combat zones. "Let's review exactly what happened." Jordan hovered near the door, uncertain whether he was supposed to be present for what felt like an official investigation. Tessa had been politely but firmly excluded, her protests about public interest falling on deaf ears when national security concerns were mentioned. Captain Monroe stepped forward. his Navy training evident in the way he addressed the technical display. Our flight was westbound at 15,000 Awidoat following commercial airways. We had clearance for straight and level flight through this sector. He indicated a green line across the screen. Mara manipulated the controls, and a second flight path appeared red, cutting across the green line at what looked like a dangerously acute angle. This is the cargo flight. Filed flight plan shows a standard departure from Edwards, routing through restricted airspace before joining commercial airways. Dwayne leaned forward, his finger tracing the intersection point. There. That's where he cut across our path. That's where we had to take emergency action. Not exactly, Mara replied, adjusting the display to show a time-lapse sequence. Watch this. The screen came alive with moving icons representing both aircraft. Dwayne watched his own plane's steady progress along the green line, while the red cargo plane followed its assigned route. Then suddenly the red icon jerked sideways, diving and banking in a sharp deviation that brought it directly across his aircraft's path. Son of a Dwayne started, then caught himself. That's exactly what I said completely. Reckless. Keep watching, Chuck said quietly from his position near the back wall. The sequence continued, and now a third icon appeared on the screen. Smaller yellow, moving erratically at a lower altitude. The cargo plane's sudden maneuver hadn't just crossed Dwayne's path. It had also avoided a collision with his third aircraft by a margin that made Monroe whistle softly. "What's that?" Dwayne demanded, pointing at the yellow icon. Littered to Collins consulted her data logs. Private aircraft VFR flight not in contact with ATC. Looks like the pilot got disoriented in the heat thermals and climbed unexpectedly into controlled airspace. The cargo flight's maneuver avoided both aircraft, Monroe said slowly, his professional assessment overriding any loyalty to his employer's narrative. That's extraordinary spatial awareness and reaction time. Crow spoke for the first time since entering the room, his voice steady and matter-of-fact. Saw him on TCS about 30 seconds before impact. Radio calls weren't getting through. Probably a student pilot panicked. Choice was to maintain course and let physics sort it out, or execute a precision maneuver that saved 3 aircraft instead of letting 2 crash. Chuck finished. The room fell silent, except for the hum of electronics and the distant whisper of air conditioning. On the screen, the replay continued, showing how Crow's split-second decision had threaded the needle between Dwayne's jet and the climbing private plane, avoiding catastrophe through a combination of skill and nerve that most pilots would never possess. Dwayne stared at the display, his jaw working as he processed information that completely contradicted his assumptions. But we still had to dive. We still went into emergency procedures. Because Captain Crow couldn't warn you, Mara explained. His radio was locked on emergency frequency, trying to raise the climbing aircraft. Your pilot did exactly what he should have. Took immediate, evasive action when he saw an aircraft deviation. Monroe nodded grimly. Standard protocol. If you see another aircraft change course unexpectedly, you assume the worst and react accordingly. I couldn't know he was saving our lives. How many people were on that climbing aircraft? Jordan asked from the doorway, his voice barely above a whisper. Mara checked her logs. 3 father and 2 kids, returning from a fishing trip. Single-engine Cessna, probably overloaded and struggling in the thermal conditions. The number hit the room like a physical presence. 3 lives. A family that would have been lost if Crow had followed regulations instead of instinct. Dwayne's anger was beginning to look like something far more complex and uncomfortable. "Show me his approach," Chuck said, moving closer to the display. The screen shifted to focus on the cargo plane's landing pattern. Even in digital abstraction, Crow's flying showed extraordinary precision. A textbook approach that brought the aircraft down safely despite the stress and fuel consumption of the emergency maneuver. 40 years of flying, Jordan said, his voice stronger now. 40 years without an accident, without a violation, without a single passenger injury. Captain Crow doesn't take chances. He manages them. Dwayne looked at the young mechanic, then at Crow, then back at the display, showing the 3 aircraft that could have become debris scattered across 20 meters of desert. His celebrity certainty was cracking, replaced by something that looked uncomfortably like doubt. "There's more," Chuck said quietly. Mara's hands hesitated over the controls. "Some of the flight's details are classified." "He's already seen the important part," Chuck replied, nodding toward the screen. "The part that shows Captain Crow's character. But if he wants to understand why that maneuver was necessary beyond just avoiding a collision..." The sentence hung unfinished, loaded with implications that made the air conditioning's hum seem suddenly loud. Dwayne's voice was quieter when he spoke again. Some of the bluster drained away. "What aren't you telling me?" Chuck exchanged a look with Crow, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. "The cargo flight wasn't routine transport. We were carrying a wounded soldier. Critical condition, emergency medical transport from a forward operating base. Every minute mattered. The evasive maneuver cost us altitude and airspeed," Crow added, his voice carrying a weight that suggested the decision had cost more than just fuel. "But following normal procedures would have cost time we couldn't spare." "Time for what?" Dwayne asked, though his voice suggested he was beginning to understand. "Time for someone to live," Chuck said simply. The room's silence stretched longer this time, broken only by the soft ping of incoming data from aircraft scattered across the southwestern sky. On the screen, the 3 flight paths seemed frozen in time. A moment of crisis that had been resolved by split-second thinking and 40 years of accumulated skill. Monroe cleared his throat. "Sir, the telemetry confirms everything they're saying. The maneuver was dangerous, yet it was brilliant. Most pilots wouldn't have even seen all 3 aircraft in time, let alone calculated a solution that saved everyone." Dwayne stared at the display, at the yellow icon representing a family of 3 who had no idea how close they'd come to being a statistic. His hands rested flat on the conference table, and something in his posture suggested the fight was going out of him. "You saved them," he said finally, looking at Crow. "All of them. The family in the Cessna, your passenger, my crew, and I stood out there and called you reckless." Crow's response was characteristically understated. "You were scared for your people. That's what good leaders do. Good leaders don't humiliate heroes in front of cameras." Dwayne replied, his voice heavy with something that might have been shame. Chuck stepped forward, his presence somehow managing to be both commanding and comforting. "Good leaders own their mistakes and learn from them. Question is, what are you going to do with what you know now?" Outside, Tessa's live stream was still running, her commentary keeping several thousand viewers updated on the mysterious meeting inside the operations building. The desert sun was lower now, painting the airstrip in golden light that made everything look cinematic. But inside the air-conditioned briefing room, there was no drama, no performance, just the slow, uncomfortable process of a man confronting the difference between what he'd assumed and what had actually happened. And in that confrontation lay the seed of something more important than any viral video or celebrity moment. The recognition that true heroism often happened without applause, without recognition, without anyone but the heroes themselves knowing how close disaster had come. The walk back to the cargo plane felt different from the aggressive march that had begun the confrontation. The desert air was cooler now as the sun dipped lower, and Dwayne's steps had lost their purposeful anger, replaced by something heavier, the reluctant gait of a man approaching an uncomfortable truth. Chuck led the small group across the tarmac, his boots crunching softly on gravel that seemed to absorb sound rather than echo it. Behind him, Crow moved with his characteristic economy of motion, while Lieutenant Collins maintained professional distance, her role now more observer than referee. "Keep your voice down," Chuck said quietly as they approached the cargo plane's open door. "Someone inside isn't in any condition for loud conversations." Dwayne nodded, his throat tight as the implications of Chuck's words settled over him. Through the aircraft's open hatch, he could see the dim interior, emergency lighting casting long shadows across what looked like a makeshift medical bay. The inside of the cargo plane had been configured for one purpose: keeping someone alive during transport. Medical equipment lined the bulkheads. Monitors with steady green lines, IV drips, portable oxygen units that hummed quietly in the background. The usual cargo space had been replaced with stretchers, emergency supplies, and enough medical technology to stock a small trauma unit. On the primary stretcher lay the injured veteran, a man perhaps 30 years old, his face pale beneath oxygen cannulas, bandages covering his left shoulder and arm. His eyes were closed, but his breathing was steady, monitored by machines that beeped softly in the controlled environment. Dwayne stopped just inside the aircraft's threshold, his celebrity confidence evaporating in the presence of genuine suffering. This wasn't a movie set or a photo opportunity. This was real pain, real consequence, real life hanging in the balance. A medic in civilian clothes looked up from checking IV lines. "He's stable now," she said quietly to Chuck. "But it was close for a while. The altitude loss from your maneuver actually helped less strain on his cardiovascular system during the emergency." Chuck nodded, his expression grave. "How much time did we save?" 40 minutes, maybe more, in his condition." She didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. 40 minutes had made the difference between life and death. Crow moved to check the stretcher restraints with the careful attention of someone who understood that turbulence could turn medical equipment into projectiles. His weathered hands worked with practice efficiency, ensuring everything was secure for what would likely be another difficult landing. "Classified operation," Chuck explained quietly to Dwayne, who stood transfixed by the scene. He was injured during a mission that doesn't officially exist in a place we're not officially operating. Normal medical evacuation wasn't an option. Dwayne's voice was barely above a whisper. "What happened to him?" "IED?" the medic replied without looking up. "Shrapnel damage, internal bleeding, compromised circulation. He needed surgery hours ago, but the field medical team stabilized him enough for transport. And the maneuver that nearly took down my plane," Dwayne said slowly, the pieces falling into place. "That bought him the time he needed, bought him his life," Chuck corrected. Captain Crow had to choose between following regulations and saving a soldier. He chose the soldier. The veteran stirred slightly, his eyes opening to focus on the small group surrounding his stretcher. His voice was weak but clear when he spoke. "Did we make it?" "We made it," Crow replied, his tone gentle in a way that suggested this wasn't his first conversation with a wounded passenger. "Medical team standing by. You're going to be fine, son." The soldier's gaze found Dwayne, recognition flickering across his features. "The Rock," he whispered. a ghost of a smile touching his lips. Man, my kids are never going to believe this. Dwayne stepped closer, his own smile forced but sincere. What are their names? Emma and Jake, 8 and 10. The veteran's breathing was labored, but his eyes brightened. They think you can beat up anyone. They're not wrong, Dwayne replied, but his voice carried none of its usual swagger. But today, I met some people who were even tougher than me. He glanced at Crow, who was quietly adjusting medical equipment with the same precision he'd shown at the aircraft controls. The old pilot's concentration was complete, his movements economical. Every action focused on the welfare of his passenger. 40 years of this, Dwayne said, more to himself than anyone else. Not all of them this dramatic, Crow replied without looking up. Most flights are routine. Load cargo, file a flight plan, deliver safely. That's the job. But when it's not routine, Crow's pale eyes found Dwayne's face. When it's not routine, you remember why you learned to fly in the first place, to serve something bigger than yourself. The simplicity of the statement hit harder than any dramatic speech. Dwayne looked around the makeshift medical bay at the monitors and IV lines, and careful preparation that had turned a cargo plane into a life support system. This was heroism without fanfare, service without recognition, skill applied where it mattered most. The near collision, Dwayne said quietly, the evasive maneuver. I stood out there and called you reckless. You were protecting your people. Crow replied matter-of-factly. That's not wrong. You just didn't have all the information. I should have asked instead of assumed. Fear makes us all stupid sometimes. The medic interjected, checking the veteran's pulse. Fight or flight response doesn't leave much room for rational assessment. Chuck moved closer to Dwayne, his presence somehow both commanding and reassuring. Difference between a good man and a great one isn't whether you make mistakes. It's what you do after you realize you've made them. Outside the aircraft, they could hear the sound of vehicles approaching. An ambulance and medical transport preparing to transfer the veteran to a proper hospital. The mission that had begun with life or death urgency was entering its final phase. Lieutenant Collins appeared in the aircraft's doorway. Transport team is here. Hospital's been briefed and they're ready to receive. The medic began preparing the veteran for transfer, disconnecting portable monitors and switching to battery-powered systems. The process was choreographed with military precision, every movement calculated to maintain stability during the handoff. Thank you, the veteran said as they prepared to move him, his voice directed at Crow. I know what you risked up there. Crow's response was characteristically humble. Just doing the job, son. You focus on getting better. As the medical team wheeled the stretcher toward the waiting ambulance, Dwayne found himself walking alongside Chuck and Crow. The confrontation that had begun with anger and accusation was ending with something far more complex. Understanding, regret, and a profound shift in perspective. How many people know about this? Dwayne asked quietly. The people who need to know, Chuck replied. Command structure, medical team, base operations, maybe a dozen total. No media coverage, no public recognition. That's how it works, Crow said simply. Most of the important things happen when nobody's watching. Dwayne stopped walking, his hands clenched at his sides as the full weight of his afternoon's behavior settled over him. I made a fool of myself out there in front of cameras, in front of people who respect you. You made a mistake, Chuck corrected. Human beings do that. But I did it loudly, publicly. I humiliated a man who deserved medals, not accusations. The ambulance was pulling away now, red lights flashing as it carried its precious cargo toward definitive medical care. The mission that had required split-second decisions and 40 years of accumulated skill was finally complete. "Question is," Chuck said, watching the ambulance disappear into the desert distance, "what are you going to do about it?" Dwayne looked back toward the operations building where he could see Tessa still live streaming, her camera capturing the ambulance departure and the small group of men standing by the cargo plane. Her viewer count was probably in the thousands now, all of them waiting to see how this story would end. "I started this in front of everyone," Dwayne said slowly. "I guess I better finish it the same way." Chuck nodded approval. Truth has a way of setting things right, even when it makes us look smaller than we thought we were. As they walked back toward the main gathering, Dwayne realized that the most difficult part of the afternoon still lay ahead, standing in front of cameras and admitting that everything he'd believed about the day's events had been wrong. But sometimes he was beginning to understand the hardest thing to do was also the right thing to do. And in that understanding lay the seed of something more valuable than any viral video or public triumph. The possibility of becoming the kind of man who deserved the respect he'd always simply assumed was his due. The golden light of sunset painted the desert airstrip in cinematic hues as the small group returned to where Tessa's camera waited, their footsteps creating a measured cadence against the gravel that spoke more of reluctant determination than the aggressive march that had begun the afternoon's drama. Her live stream count had climbed past 3,000 viewers, turning what had begun as local news into a national curiosity. Comments scrolled past faster than she could read them. A digital Greek chorus offering opinions on celebrity behavior, military respect, and the nature of heroism. The crowd had grown substantially during their time in the operations building and aboard the cargo plane. Word had spread through the small community surrounding the airstrip like wildfire through dry brush. Mechanics from other hangars abandoning their work. Off-duty pilots emerging from air-conditioned offices, even a few families from the nearby town who'd heard about the confrontation on social media and snorts, driven out to witness what promised to be either a spectacular apology or an equally spectacular doubling down. They gathered in a loose semicircle, phones raised like digital torches, creating an amphitheater of attention that transformed the utilitarian airstrip into something resembling a modern coliseum. The energy was different now, though. Where earlier the crowd had carried the electric anticipation of conflict, now there was something heavier, more solemn. The collective sense that they were about to witness something significant. Something that transcended simple entertainment. Children sat on their parents' shoulders. Teenagers updated their followers in real time. Adults held their phones steady, understanding instinctively that they might be recording something worth preserving. Latier Mara Collins took charge of the scene with military efficiency, positioning herself between the crowd and the small group returning from the aircraft. Her uniform remained crisp despite the heat and stress of the afternoon. Her bearing unchanged by the celebrity drama that had temporarily disrupted her orderly domain. She carried herself with the authority of someone who'd managed far more chaotic situations in far more dangerous places. "Folks," she announced, her voice carrying easily across the assembled observers. "We're going to make a brief statement to address what happened here today. After that, I'll need everyone to clear the operational areas. This is still an active airstrip with scheduled flights, and safety protocols remain in effect regardless of the afternoon's excitement." Tessa adjusted her position for the best camera angle, her journalistic instincts fully engaged despite the personal investment she now felt in the story's outcome. This was no longer just a celebrity outburst or a simple case of mistaken accusations. This was a story about accountability, about the difference between public perception and private truth, about the courage required to stand in front of cameras and admit fundamental error. Her commentary had evolved throughout the afternoon, shifting from sensationalist excitement to something more thoughtful, more nuanced. "We're back on the tarmac at Desert Winds," she said into her phone, her voice carrying the gravity of someone who understood she was documenting something significant. "Dwayne Johnson is about to make a statement following what appears to have been a major revelation about the flight incident that started today's confrontation. I have to tell you, folks, what started as a simple celebrity news story has become something much deeper, much more important." The live stream comments reflected the audience's investment in the resolution where earlier viewers had come for spectacle, celebrity conflict, potential physical confrontation, the entertainment value of watching someone famous lose their temper. Now they seemed genuinely curious about accountability, about what it looked like when someone with massive public platform chose truth over image management. Dwayne stepped forward, and the crowd's murmur faded to expectant silence that seemed to stretch across not just the physical gathering, but the thousands of remote viewers connected through Tessa's phone. Under the desert sun, his celebrity polish looked somehow diminished. Still imposing, still carrying the charismatic presence that had made him a global icon, but tempered by something that might have been humility. The swagger was gone, replaced by something more substantial and, paradoxically, more genuinely powerful. He looked out over the assembled faces, at the cameras recording his every expression, at the real-time judgment of thousands of strangers who would dissect his words, analyze his body language, and ultimately decide whether his accountability was genuine or merely calculated damage control. The weight of that scrutiny was visible in his posture, not defensive, but certainly aware of the stakes. "Earlier today," he began, his voice carrying easily across the tarmac, but lacking the performative energy that had characterized his afternoon rage. "I accused Captain Elias Crow of reckless flying that endangered lives. I stood right here in front of many of you and called him careless, irresponsible, and dangerous. I was wrong." The simple admission sent a ripple through the crowd that was both audible and visible. A collective intake of breath, a subtle shifting of weight, a realignment of attention. In an era of carefully crafted PR statements and lawyers' non-apologies, the directness caught people off guard. Tessa's comment stream exploded with reactions. Some appreciative of the honesty, others skeptical about the motives, most simply surprised by the blunt acknowledgement of error. "I reacted out of fear," Dwayne continued, his eyes finding Crow among the assembled observers. The old pilot stood with his characteristic quiet dignity, neither pleased nor uncomfortable with the attention, simply present in the way that suggested this was just another moment in a long life, full of moments that had tested his character. "My plane encountered what felt like a dangerous situation, and instead of seeking to understand what had happened, instead of asking questions or considering alternative explanations, I looked for someone to blame. I found Captain Crow, and I blamed him publicly, loudly and wrongly. Chuck stood slightly behind and to the left, his presence somehow both supporting and monitoring. His expression remained neutral, but there was something in his posture that suggested approval of Dwayne's approach. Not the approval of a coach watching a student perform well, but the acknowledgement of one professional recognizing another's competent handling of a difficult situation. "What I didn't know," Dwayne said, his voice growing stronger as he moved deeper into the truth he'd been forced to confront. "What I couldn't have known because I didn't bother to ask was that Captain Crow had just executed a maneuver that saved 3 aircraft and everyone aboard them. While I was experiencing what felt like dangerous flying, he was actually preventing a genuine catastrophe." The crowd's attention sharpened. This wasn't just apology. This was revelation. Parents pulled their children closer, understanding that they were witnessing an education in how quickly circumstances could be misunderstood, how easy it was for perspective to become distorted by fear and assumption. He avoided a mid-air collision with a climbing aircraft, while simultaneously shortening his flight time to save the life of a critically wounded soldier. Dwayne continued, each word carrying weight that seemed to physically impact the listeners. He made a split-second decision that required 40 years of experience, nerves of steel, and the kind of spatial awareness that most of us can't even imagine. And he did it all while I was preparing to storm over here and humiliate him in front of everyone. Jordan, standing with the ground crew, felt tears prick his eyes as vindication for his mentor mixed with sadness that such vindication had been necessary. Around him, the mechanics and support staff who'd watched Crow work quietly for years exchanged glances that carried complex emotions. Satisfaction that their respect for the old pilot had been justified. Sorrow that it had taken a celebrity's mistake to make his heroism visible to the wider world. Captain Crow has 40 years of accident-free flying. Dwayne continued, his voice carrying across the airstrip and into phones that would broadcast these words far beyond the desert. 40 years of putting other people's safety above his own comfort, above regulations, above the easy choice. 40 years of making decisions that we'll never hear about. Saving lives that will never know his name. Serving with the kind of dedication that our country depends on, but rarely recognizes. He paused, the silence stretching long enough for the weight of those 40 years to settle over the assembled crowd. In that silence, people began to understand the magnitude of what they were witnessing. Not just a celebrity apology, but a window into the invisible infrastructure of heroism that surrounded them daily, performed by people they'd never notice. And today, Dwayne continued, when someone needed him most, when a wounded soldier's life hung in the balance, he made a split-second decision that saved that man's life along with everyone else in the sky. He chose service over safety, duty over regulation, courage over compliance. And for his trouble, he got to listen to me call him reckless. The crowd was completely silent now. The kind of silence that indicated total engagement rather than mere attention. Even the children seemed to understand that something important was happening, something worth remembering. Captain Crow, Dwayne said, looking directly at the elderly pilot. I apologize. Not just for being wrong, but for being wrong so loudly, so publicly, so disrespectfully. You deserve better from me, and everyone here deserves better from me. You've spent 4 decades earning respect through service, and I nearly undid that in 4 minutes of ignorant anger. The apology was complete, unqualified, and clearly sincere. There was no hedging, no, if anyone was offended, language, no attempt to share blame or minimize the error. It was the kind of accountability that had become rare enough to be notable, powerful enough to shift the entire energy of the gathering. Tessa found herself adjusting her commentary to match the unexpected gravity of the moment. This is remarkable, folks, she said quietly into her phone, her voice carrying genuine admiration. We're watching a public figure take complete responsibility for a mistake without deflection, without qualification, without any attempt to save face. In an age of spin and damage control, this is what actual accountability looks like. Crow stepped forward, his voice carrying the same steady calm it had maintained throughout the afternoon's drama. The man who had absorbed a celebrity's public anger without retaliation, who had remained dignified under accusation, now faced the cameras with the same unshakable composure. Mr. Johnson, he said, his words reaching both the immediate audience and the thousands watching remotely. "I appreciate your words more than I can express, but there's something you said that's more important than any apology. Something that everyone here needs to understand." The crowd leaned in, sensing something significant in the old pilot's tone. After hours of being the target of attention, first negative, then sympathetic, Crow was finally taking control of his own narrative. "You said you reacted out of fear for your people. That's not weakness. That's leadership. That's exactly what good leaders do when they think their team is in danger. The fact that you were wrong about the threat doesn't change the fact that you were ready to fight for your crew." The generosity of the response seemed to catch Dwayne off guard. He'd prepared for anger, defensiveness, perhaps grudging acceptance of his apology. He hadn't expected forgiveness paired with understanding, hadn't anticipated being taught lessons about leadership by the man he'd publicly humiliated. Chuck stepped forward, his voice carrying easily across the assembled crowd and into the digital space where thousands continued to watch and comment. "Fear's not the problem," he said, his words reaching beyond the immediate audience to address universal human experience. "Fear keeps us alive, keeps us protective of the people we care about, keeps us alert to danger. Fear is a tool, and like any tool, it can be used well or poorly." The philosophy behind the words was accessible to everyone present, but the source gave them additional weight. This wasn't abstract wisdom. This was practical guidance from someone who'd faced genuine danger, made life or death decisions under pressure, survived situations where fear management meant the difference between success and, catastrophe. "The problem comes when we let fear make our decisions for us." Chuck continued, "When we stop asking questions and start throwing punches, when we assume the worst instead of seeking truth, that's when fear stops being protective and starts being destructive." The crowd absorbed the lesson with the focused attention of students recognizing profound instruction. Parents' snorts made mental notes about conversations they wanted to have with their children. Teenagers found themselves unexpectedly engaged with concepts that seemed immediately relevant to their own lives. "True strength," Chuck said, his gaze taking in the entire crowd before focusing on the cameras that would carry his words far beyond the desert shows itself in how we treat people who can't defend themselves, how we respond when we discover we're wrong, and how we choose to use our voices when we have the power to be heard. Jordan found his own voice, calling out from the crowd with the nervous energy of someone speaking in front of far more people than he'd ever addressed before. "Captain Crow, sir." The old pilot turned toward the young mechanic, eyebrows raised in gentle inquiry, his expression encouraging rather than intimidating. "Thank you," Jordan said, his voice carrying clearly across the tarmac. "For everything you've taught us. For the way you fly, the way you serve, the way you treat people. For showing us what it looks like to do the right thing when nobody's watching. To serve without expecting recognition. To carry responsibility without complaining about the weight." The words seemed to unlock something in the crowd. Applause began, not the theatrical clapping of an entertainment audience seeking to participate in spectacle, but the sustained, respectful appreciation of people who'd witnessed something genuinely meaningful. It started with the ground crew, the mechanics and support staff who'd worked alongside Crow for years, then spread outward, encompassing the gathered spectators and even reaching into Tessa's live stream comments. The applause was different from what Dwayne was accustomed to receiving. This wasn't appreciation for performance or entertainment. This was recognition of character, acknowledgement of service, respect for sacrifice. It was the kind of ovation that couldn't be manufactured or bought, only earned through decades of consistent choices in favor of duty over comfort. Crow stood quietly through the applause, his weathered hands clasped behind his back, his expression unchanged. The attention neither pleased nor discomforted him. It simply was another moment in a long life full of moments that had tested and proven his character. When the noise faded, he spoke once more, his voice carrying the wisdom of someone who'd learned to see clearly. "The young man's got it backwards," he said, a hint of humor touching his voice for the first time all day. "You don't serve for the thanks. You serve because the work needs doing. You serve because someone has to, and you're capable, and you're present." Today was just another day's work. The humility was so complete, so genuine, that it seemed to physically move the crowd. Several of the older veterans in attendance straightened their shoulders, recognizing echoes of their own service philosophy. A few of the younger mechanics looked at Crow with something approaching awe, understanding for the first time the depth of character that had been working quietly among them. Dwayne stepped forward one last time, his voice carrying a resolve that hadn't been present at the beginning of the afternoon, a clarity that suggested the day's events had fundamentally altered his understanding of strength, service, and responsibility. "I came here to film a documentary about aviation heroes," he said, addressing both the immediate crowd and the vast remote audience that continued to watch. "I thought I knew what that looked like. Dramatic rescues, public recognition, obvious courage displayed in obvious ways. I expected to find people who looked like heroes from movies, who acted like heroes from stories." He gestured toward Crow, toward the quiet man who had absorbed public humiliation without retaliation, who had remained dignified under false accusation, who continued to deflect praise even as his heroism became undeniable. Today, I learned that real heroism looks like Captain Crow, like 40 years of quiet service, split-second decisions made for other people's benefit, and the humility to call life-saving actions just another day's work. Real heroes don't look like movie stars. They look like the person sitting next to you on the bus, the mechanic working on your car, the pilot flying your plane. They're everywhere, and most of the time, we never know. He looked directly into Tessa's camera, addressing not just the thousands of current viewers, but the millions who would eventually see the clips, share the videos, discuss the implications in their own communities and families. Real heroes don't need to announce themselves. They don't need applause or recognition or viral videos. They just do the work, save the lives, and go home. The rest of us, we need to learn to recognize them, respect them, and get out of their way so they can keep saving people. As the formal statement concluded, and the crowd began to disperse with a satisfied energy of people who'd witnessed something genuine, Tessa wrapped up her live stream with commentary that reflected her own transformed understanding of the day's events. What started as a celebrity confrontation became an education in the difference between appearing strong and actually being strong. She told her viewers, "We've seen what accountability looks like when it's genuine rather than calculated. We've seen what heroism looks like when it's real rather than performed. And we've learned that sometimes the most important stories happen in the least expected places, told by people who never intended to be in the spotlight." The sun continued its descent toward the horizon, painting the desert in deeper shades of gold and orange, transforming the utilitarian airstrip into something cinematic without any effort from cameras or directors. But for once, the real thing was more compelling than any performance could have been. Night settled over desert winds with the gradual authority of desert darkness, transforming the harsh afternoon landscape into something softer, more intimate. Painted in silver moonlight and the amber glow of runway lights that stretched across the tarmac like a constellation fallen to earth. The last of the spectators had departed, their phones full of footage that would fuel social media discussions for days to come. Their cars disappearing into the darkness with headlights cutting through air that still carried the lingering heat of the day's drama. Tessa had finally ended her live stream after nearly 6 hours of continuous coverage, the viewer count having peaked at nearly 5,000 before gradually declining as the formal drama gave way to quiet conversation and the natural human desire to process what they'd witnessed. Her phone battery was nearly dead, her voice from hours of commentary. But her notebook was full of contact information and follow-up story ideas. This had become more than just a day's work. It had become a career-defining moment. The kind of story that journalists spent years hoping to stumble across. Inside Hangar 7, fluorescent lights cast long shadows across workbenches littered with engine parts, technical manuals, and the accumulated detritus of people who worked with their hands to keep complex machines functioning safely. The air smelled of metal lubricant, coffee that had been brewing too long, and the particular staleness that accumulated in spaces where people spent more time thinking about mechanical problems than creature comforts. Jordan had produced a small camp table and folding chairs from storage, creating an impromptu gathering place near the hangar's open doors where a desert air could mix with a controlled environment inside. The group that had weathered the afternoon storm sat in comfortable silence, paper cups of black coffee warming their hands as the desert temperature dropped with a surprising speed that caught newcomers off guard, but felt familiar to anyone who'd spent time in the Southwest. The contrast was sharp. From blazing heat that made thinking difficult to cool air that invited reflection, contemplation, the kind of quiet conversation that happened when people had shared something significant. Dwayne had shed his earlier tension completely. His posture relaxed in a way that suggested genuine ease rather than performed casualness. His designer clothes looked somehow more authentic in the hangar's utilitarian setting, as if proximity to honest work had stripped away some of the artifice that seemed inseparable from celebrity culture. He sat with his elbows on his knees, coffee cup held in both hands, looking more like a man processing a profound experience than a global entertainment icon. "I owe you more than a public apology," he said to Crow, his voice carrying easily in the hangar's acoustic space, which seemed designed to make conversation intimate regardless of the building's industrial size. "I came here today thinking I understood heroism, thinking I knew what strength looked like, thinking my experience playing tough guys had taught me something about actual toughness. You taught me I had it completely backwards." Crow sipped his coffee, the cup looking small in hands that had guided aircraft through 4 decades of challenging skies. Through weather that would have grounded lesser pilots, through mechanical failures that had tested every aspect of his training and experience. His fingers slightly arthritic now, but still steady, wrapped around the cup with the same precision he brought to aircraft controls. "You weren't wrong about heroism," he replied thoughtfully, his voice carrying the considered wisdom of someone who'd had years to think about courage, service, and the responsibilities that came with both. "You just hadn't seen all the forms it takes. Takes courage to stand up in front of cameras and admit you made a mistake, especially when those cameras are connected to thousands of people ready to judge every word. Different kind of courage than flying a wounded soldier through emergency maneuvers while avoiding mid-air collisions." "Courage is courage," Chuck interjected from his position near the hangar's door, where he could watch both the conversation and the airstrip beyond. Old habits keeping him alert to his surroundings even in moments of apparent safety. Public or private, loud or quiet, recognized or invisible. What matters is whether you do the right thing when it costs you something, when it would be easier to take the safe path. His presence in the hangar felt different from his earlier appearances, less like an imposing force arriving to correct injustice, and more like a participant in a conversation among equals. The celebrity and military legend persona had been set aside, replaced by something more fundamental. A man who'd learned hard lessons and was willing to share them with others facing their own learning moments. Jordan had been quiet for most of the evening, content to listen to conversations between men who'd achieved things he could only dream about. But now he cleared his throat nervously, the sound small in the hangar's vastness. "Captain Crow, sir. That maneuver today, the one that started all this trouble. How did you even see all 3 aircraft in time to calculate a solution? I mean, the math alone." The question seemed to energize the old pilot in a way that direct praise hadn't. His eyes grew distant, as if he was looking not at the hangar walls, but at memories of countless flights, countless split-second decisions that had never made headlines, never been celebrated, never been documented anywhere except in the quiet satisfaction of problems solved and lives preserved. 40 years of looking, he said simply, but then continued with the patient tone of someone who understood that real teaching required more than simple answers. 40 years of assuming that anything can happen at any moment. "So, you'd better be ready for everything. You scan instruments. You scan sky. You listen to every radio frequency you can monitor. You watch weather patterns. You track other aircraft. You monitor your own systems. Situational awareness isn't a skill you turn on when things get dangerous. It's a way of life." Jordan leaned forward, his notebook balanced on his knee as he tried to capture not just the words, but the philosophy behind them. This was the kind of instruction that couldn't be found in textbooks, the accumulated wisdom that only came from decades of making life or death decisions under pressure. "But the math," Jordan persisted, his engineering mind grappling with the complexity of the calculations involved. 3 aircraft, different altitudes, different speeds, different trajectories. How do you calculate intercept vectors and collision avoidance that fast, even with computers? Crow smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features and revealing glimpses of the younger man who'd first learned to fly in an era when pilots depended more on instinct than instrumentation. "You don't calculate, you feel. After enough years, the physics becomes instinct. You see where things are going before they get there, like watching a movie you've seen before and knowing what comes next. It's pattern recognition." Chuck added, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd relied on similar instincts in different but equally demanding circumstances. "Your brain processes thousands of variables faster than any computer because it's been training for decades. Experience becomes intuition." Lara Collins, who had been reviewing incident reports on her tablet while listening to the conversation, looked up from the official paperwork that would document the day's events in the precise, emotionless language that government required. "The FAA is going to want a full debriefing," she said, her tone carrying both professional necessity and personal regret. "Anytime there's a deviation from filed flight plan involving civilian aircraft, they investigate. Doesn't matter how justified it was." "Will there be problems?" Dwayne asked, concern creeping into his voice as he realized the Crow's heroic actions might result in bureaucratic punishment. "I mean, he saved lives. Surely that counts for something in their evaluation." "It counts for everything in the real world," Mara replied, her expression showing the frustration of someone who'd spent years navigating the gap between operational reality and administrative procedure. "But it still has to be documented, reviewed, filed in triplicate, evaluated by people who've never been in a cockpit during an emergency. Government doesn't run on heroism. It runs on paperwork and compliance with regulations that were written by committees." Chuck's laugh was dry, but not bitter. carrying the resignation of someone who'd spent decades dealing with similar bureaucratic realities. Some things never change. Save 100 lives. Spend 3 days explaining why you broke regulations to do it. Fill out forms justifying split-second decisions to people who've never had to make one. Worth it, Crow said without hesitation, his voice carrying the absolute certainty of someone whose priorities had been tested by experience and found unshakable. Always worth it. Paperwork's just paperwork. Lives are lives. The simple certainty in his voice seemed to settle something in the hangar's atmosphere. This wasn't a man who calculated the personal cost of doing right. It was someone for whom right action was its own justification. Someone who'd internalized service so completely that bureaucratic consequences couldn't even register as real considerations. Dwayne leaned forward in his chair, his expression serious as he wrestled with ideas that had been foreign to him 12 hours earlier. I want to change my documentary. Not just add a segment about you, completely refocus it. Make it about people like you. People who serve without recognition, who make the hard choices when nobody's watching, who define strength through service rather than performance. Don't want to be famous. Crow replied immediately, his response automatic and emphatic. Fame gets in the way of the work. Fame makes people expect things, makes them want explanations for decisions that have to be made in seconds. Fame turns service into performance, and performance isn't what saves lives. It doesn't have to, Dwayne insisted, his voice carrying the passion of someone who'd found a new sense of purpose. We could focus on the service, not the individual. Show what you do without turning it into entertainment, without manufacturing drama where none exists. Show the real work, the daily choices, the accumulated wisdom that makes heroism possible. Chuck nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. Could be educational. People need to understand how much goes on behind the scenes, how many lives depend on folks they'll never meet, folks they'd walk past on the street without a second glance. Most folks have no idea how thin the line is between order and chaos, how many people work every day to keep that line from breaking. But no drama, Crow insisted, his tone firm despite its quietness. No manufactured tension, no artificial deadlines, no Hollywood nonsense. Just the work, the real work, the training, the maintenance, the preparation, the decision-making. Let people see what service actually looks like. Dwayne's commitment to the revised approach was evident in his voice, in the way he leaned forward, in the intensity of his attention. The work, the service, the daily choice to put other people's welfare above your own comfort, your own convenience, your own recognition. That's the story worth telling. That's the strength worth celebrating. Jordan had been taking notes throughout the conversation, trying to capture not just information, but wisdom. The kind of accumulated understanding that could only come from years of making choices that mattered. Now he looked up from his scribbling, his young face serious with the weight of a request that had been snorts building throughout the evening. "Captain," he said, his voice steady despite the nervousness that made his hands shake slightly. "Would you, if I do get my pilot's license someday, would you consider teaching me about the real flying? Not just the book stuff, not just the regulations and procedures, but the judgment, the decision-making, the stuff they can't test you on. The request hung in the air with the weight of someone asking for admission to something sacred, something that couldn't be purchased or demanded, but only earned through demonstrated character and commitment." Crow studied the young man's face, seeing perhaps an echo of his own younger self in the earnest desire to learn, to serve, to become worthy of responsibility for other people's lives. "Flying's not just about the license," he said finally, his voice carrying the gravity of someone imparting fundamental truth. It's about responsibility. Every time you take controls, you're responsible for every soul on board, every person on the ground below your flight path, every aircraft sharing the sky with you. You understand that weight? Yes, sir. It's about service. Your skills belong to something bigger than yourself. Your passengers, your mission, your country, your community. Everything you learn, every hour you fly, every decision you make has to be filtered through that understanding. You ready for that kind of commitment? Jordan's response was immediate and firm, carrying the conviction of someone who'd spent the day witnessing what real commitment looked like. Yes, sir. Crow nodded slowly, the gesture carrying the weight of acceptance, a formal acknowledgement that learning could begin. Then we'll start with weather theory next week. Real weather, not textbook weather. The kind that kills pilots who think they know more than they do. We'll talk about Decision M, about margins of safety, about the difference between confidence and overconfidence. The mentorship agreement struck everyone present as significant. The passing of knowledge from one generation to the next. The continuation of a tradition of excellence that transcended individual ego or personal ambition. It was the kind of relationship that built character, that created the foundation for decades of reliable service. As the evening deepened and conversations gradually became more personal, more reflective, the hangar filled with the quiet sharing of experiences that had shaped them all. Stories emerged slowly, carefully, shared among people who'd proven themselves worthy of trust through the day's events. Near midnight, as the desert cold began to penetrate even the hangar shelter, the group began to disperse. The day that had begun with anger and misunderstanding was ending with respect, education, and the kind of connection that suggested lasting change rather than temporary resolution. And in that transformation lay the day's deepest lesson. That real strength revealed itself not in never making mistakes, but in how completely and honestly one faced them when they inevitably came. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.